Well, hello, hypno hacking community. Got a real special one for you this time around. All these fun little interviews coming through. We talked to all these different people. But what have I been telling you for so many years about hypnosis and the basis of the whole thing being that just hypnotic storytelling is a thing, and that hypnosis really is just stories. Most of our lives, in fact, at this very subconscious level, is the stories we're telling ourselves, the stories that we're telling other people, and the stories that other people are telling us, and that we're choosing to believe this one and disbelieve that one, and so on and so on. So I have with me today a very special friend, Ceri Phillips, who is on the X platform at Ceri J. Phillips 1. It's Ceri with a C-E-R-I, J. Phillips 1. Ceri and I crossed paths on X Spaces I think over a year ago, just horsing around and doing things. And he's a very funny individual. And you know what? So am I. So we had a lot of fun with that. But later it came out that his profession, in fact, is storytelling. And if you have been lucky enough to run across one of Ceri's X spaces in which he tells stories, then you've already experienced this just wonderful slice of life. And Ceri, I wanted to talk to you today. First of all, thank you for being with us. I'll let you speak now.
Well, you are most welcome, and this is an honor. You know, I've done a lot of podcast spots that are very specific in nature. I haven't done a hypnosis and storytelling one yet, so this is a real treat.
Don't worry too much about the hypnosis part. I'll bring that to the party. I tell people when I recommend your X accounts in the spaces, like if you can catch one of Ceri's storytelling spaces, just go do it. Because it's an hour to an hour and a half of just pure hypnotic delight. And by hypnotic delight, I mean, I listen to your stories, I lean back in the chair and I close my eyes, and I am instantly transported into this trance state where I can see all the characters you're talking about and the action. And it's a wonderful, refreshing place for the mind to go. It helps, I think, that you have, I think, a very hypnotic storytelling voice to begin with. And so we can, explain more about that if the listeners want to hear about some of the technique or whatever. But I wanted to, by way of, say self biography, I guess, how does one become a professional storyteller?
I suppose it depends on where you are and what you want to get out of it, and at the very deepest level, what you consider storytelling to be. So I come from a culture, I'm Welsh, and the way that I started was that I didn't know what I wanted to do anymore with my life. I had retired from being an actor, not for want of work, but just I didn't want to do it anymore. I moved back to Wales from London and was wondering what I was going to do with my life, and I didn't know that storytelling was an art form. And I was working in a national trust, sort of like a protected historical site, because I knew the history of the place. Got a job giving tours. I knew I wasn't going to do that the rest of my life, but it was seeing me through, And one day, my boss at the trust said, look, we've got this storytelling festival, which is relocating from a castle not far away from Wales to another castle, which is where I worked. And we've got a couple of storytellers who are going to do something called a story walk just around the grounds of the stately home in the garden. And we need a member of staff to go with them. So please, can you go? And I was like, don't make me do this, please. This is going to be failed actors doing bad monologues and a bunch of hippies just jamming out to sweet sounds. And I'm going to be cringed to death. And sometimes storytelling can be that, but on this occasion, it very much wasn't. And there were two tellers, Heidi Dahlson from Norway and Claire Murphy, Irish storyteller who lives in Bristol in England. And about 30 seconds into Claire telling a tale, I knew that that's what I have to do. And I pursued it via a somewhat idiosyncratic route. I contacted the festival organizers themselves. It was called the Beyond the Border Festival, and they said, we've got a program where we take on new tellers, pair them up with a mentor, and prepare you to present at the next festival a show of about 30 minutes to an hour. So you've got to get to learning stories, decide what you want to do, your approach. And I used a lot of that time with my mentor, Daniel Morton, who is one of Wales's foremost storytellers, with support from Tamara Leonard Williams, who's another storyteller who worked for the festival. I took a lot of that time to actually get to a philosophical bedrock as to what storytelling is, and developed a model called the Cyfarwydd model, Cyfarwydd being the traditional Welsh word for a storyteller / philosopher. It's the post-Roman word for a druid, is what it means. It means to be familiar with something, with subject, but also to be someone who gives direction simultaneously. So you're always in a pose of learning and teaching. And in developing that model, I developed my ethos for what I do. And it's the manner that I approach all storytelling engagements. If I'm telling to 2 children, or I'm telling to hundreds of people, or I'm doing an X-Space, that's how I approach it. It's with that basis in mind of being both teacher and giving direction.
So you do approach it from the standpoint of almost, well, you said teachers. So it's not just here's a story. You're choosing stories that you feel have some purpose, some point to make. Is it more of like a performance? Because I've honestly never seen it. Maybe it's a cultural thing that in the US, I don't know if we have professional storytellers per se, but like, do you go up on stage in costume and just deliver a monologue, or what does that look like?
First off, to address the question of storytelling in the United States, and if this podcast can go any way to actually changing this, I'd love it to. There are storytelling traditions in the States, and many Native American traditions that are still kept alive. The Gullah people as well also have a rich storytelling tradition, and in Appalachia, but they are very much still folk traditions. They haven't been elevated as they perhaps should be to being a full performance medium that lives alongside other art forms. And that is a great tragedy, because the US has maybe the greatest untapped wealth of legends for this performance medium. So if this podcast can do something for that, go out and do it. Contact me. I'll help you get started. If you want to do that, I'll help you do it. What it looks like from my perspective, it's very different. Lots of different forms of thought go into what constitutes storytelling in the oral tradition, which is what we do. It is a one-way conversation, but a conversation nonetheless. The audience has to feel so at ease that they feel that they are within the tale. You can't do that simply by watching a performance. It's very rare that you watch a movie and feel so immersed that you feel like you're living in the film. You don't. It's an external thing. It's an artifact that you get to pick up and look at, You don't say to yourself, you know what? For 50 minutes, I was Vito Corleone. No, nobody does that. You don't go, it was terrible when I was shot, wasn't it? I felt so scared in the hospital. No, you don't feel that. But with an able storyteller, you do feel as though you are walking around inside the tale. You don't adopt the pose of the characters, but you are in that world. If I can get you to having a free movie inside your head, that's great. If I can get that total immersion where you're seeing things on stage occurring that aren't actually there, that's me doing it right. One of the markers of success is if someone comes up to me after a show and says, "You're so funny, you're so talented, you should be on TV." It's not a failure because I've entertained them, but it's not what I'm aiming for. What I'm aiming for is that transported me back to when I was 5 years old. And my grandmother used to sit me and my cousins around in the airing cupboard and tell us tales. Or I was there. Or who was that tall man with a crown and a beard on stage with you? How did you make that happen? I'm like, there was no man.
Has that happened?
Yes, once for me, and other tellers, after I've told them that happened, have gone, "Oh yeah."
Are you joking? That's incredible. I mean, so this is like just confirming my decision to have you do this interview, because you are talking about hypnosis, plain and simple. You were talking about when I sit with a client, for example, and it doesn't really matter what sort of change work they're wanting to accomplish, we are going to go into this deep theta state of the brain where everything slows down and I kind of get your conscious world to disappear. And I want you to start visualizing a scene, and we're going to like place you in this scene, and we're going to make it so real, as you just said, that the person gets lost in the story. Except in my case, it's very much a collaborative effort. I may set the scene of like it's a park or something, but usually once the client is beginning to move deeper into that territory, they can tell me like, oh, and there's a dog, you know, and there's a apple tree, and it's crazy to see where the subconscious mind goes to, because you talk about somebody says, oh, who was the guy on stage with you? And I'll have this experience with a client that gets so very deeply into the what I call the trance state, that, you know, they're not only are they saying like, oh, I can hear the birds chirping and I can see this dog and I can feel the sunlight, you know, my arm is actually feeling warmer. They'll go off into this like, oh, there's a barn in the distance. And I'm like, go check out the barn. Tell me what you see. And it's suddenly they're transported back to grandpa's farm, and they're 7 years old, and like they're having this like almost out of body experience where like, okay, I didn't tell you this story. I didn't know you had grandpa's barn. That's not something I can like drop in there. But now they're telling the story with me, and it sounds very much like what you're describing.
Yeah, one of the there are a couple of points. One that is very much in keeping with what you're saying, and another one which is akin to it, which is an insight that is perhaps not necessarily to be expected. And the first sort of instance was, I can't remember exactly which folk tale, so it wasn't a myth, it wasn't a high legend or a particularly well-known or epic tale, because sometimes, you know, that I've got in my repertoire that I can confidently just stand up and tell about 370 or so tales, or from memory. They're different every single time I tell them, but the bones of it, the narrative is the same and fixed. So I'm able to tell that many. And the shortest one is about 30 seconds, which I would, you know, reliably be able to say, yeah, that is a story, all the way up to a couple of hours with full context and telling. And so it was bang in the middle. It was a 20-minute story, a folk tale, rough and ready, very entertaining. The immersion happens. And there's a part in the story where there's a lake. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, why did you put a boathouse on the lake? And I didn't mention a boathouse on the lake. There's no boathouse on the actual lake in question. But for whatever reason, that person pictured a lake that they had seen, or perhaps the lake of their mind's eye. And they thought it was funny that I'd put a boathouse on this lake and brought it up. And it was almost as if they wanted to say, I kind of lost the immersion a little bit, whilst what they were describing was total immersion, because there was no boathouse. And I just freaked me out a bit. I'm like, I don't know, pal. I'm sorry. Do you smell burning toast at the same time? I don't know. You're in the midst of a stroke. But no, it's then you do come to realize, after hearing these things many, many times, you start to not be afraid of it and realize the power of what this actually is and what you're tapping into, that it becomes normal, you know. And the other instance was, I was working in a school, in the equivalent of an elementary school, a primary school. And we had done a portion of our mythological cycle. This in 4 branches. There was probably at some point a whole tree, but 4 branches remain, which creates our mythological cycle. It's called the Mabinogion. And it's as old as who knows. Who knows? The very roots of this tree are perhaps tens of thousands of years old. Conservatively, we can say it's a few thousand years old. And there's been addition over the years. As things get written down, there's the author's hand, and you can date that. And some of that then, first time it's written is in the medieval era, but it's thousands of years before that. There's a portion of the first branch, which is the story of the king of Dyfed, the Pendavigs, or maybe even warlord of Dyfed in the days before kings, who goes on this incredible journey to the other world, because we don't have an underworld or a heaven or a hell at this stage. There's an other world. a veiled world beyond our understanding that is parallel to ours but very different, where the Tylwyth Teg live, the fair folk, who aren't little Tinkerbells in our culture. They are tall, they are terrifyingly beautiful to behold, and creatures of pure magic. And he swaps places with their king, takes his guise and becomes their king. And there's all the travails. He falls in love with a woman from the other world, and a whole bunch of crazy, very, very familiar, if you're familiar with fairy tales, very familiar things happen, but also very, very unique things also. And then the action shifts. It's very unique in mythology to have that happen. The action just, zoop, you're somewhere else suddenly. You're on the other side of Wales with a completely different set of characters. And that's where the narrative goes. And it's that portion I focused on in this school. And you have a different king who is a great rearer of horses. All the best war horses in Europe come from this place. And he has a problem because it's been prophesied that his mare, his prized mare, is to give birth to the greatest horse that ever lived. And every year in the stable, when she goes through her labour, by morning, the foal is gone. Year after year this happens, and a rumour goes round the kingdom. The kingdom is called Gwent Yscoed. The king is called Ternon. That there's a monster that comes and collects and eats the foal every year. Now, he's a great king, he's a great warrior, and he goes, I'm not scared of any monster. So when she falls pregnant again, that particular year, he waits up inside the barn with his sword, watches her give birth, and he waits. And through the window, there comes an arm, an unfeasibly long arm with a clawed hand, and grabs the foal. And before the monster can claim another, he cuts off the arm. The monster screeches and flees, leaving a trail of blood, and he rushes after it from the barn to slay it. And then realizes he's left the barn door open, and he's not going to lose a foal, this time not to a monster, but just by leaving the barn door open. So he rushes back. And the sound of the screeching of the monster as it escapes merges and changes as he approaches the barn. And he realizes that there's the sound of a crying baby. And he discovers, behind the barn door, a golden-haired infant. He locks the barn, takes it to his wife, and they decide to raise the child. Now, completely unbeknownst to him, on the other side of Wales, where all the original action happens in the kingdom of Dyfed, King Pwyll, the one who's gone to the other world, fallen in love with the beautiful woman, fairy figure, the perfect woman, Rhiannon, he's had a child with her, who's now missing. It turns out, of course, unbeknownst to Ternon, that this is the child. And the child was stolen away. It's blamed on her, on the queen, on Rhiannon, because she was not from our world. And all the handmaids who wanted Pwyll to marry one of them, they conspired, kidnapped the child, and before she woke up, they smeared her in pig's blood and said she ate the child. She's a creature from another world, of course she did. Whereas what they probably did, even though it's not explicitly said in the tale, is they handed it to this monster who carried it around. And then he went over to the other side of Wales to get a foal as well. So now a prince and the foal that will be the greatest horse in the world. What a meal. But the plan is foiled. Now the child grows up faster than any child, is able to run, is strong, his hair grows long and golden, and he's able to recite poetry all by the age of 1. And because he's developed so quickly, Ternon recognizes him. He said, I fought alongside this face. This is the face of Pwyll, king of Dyfed, and they take him home. And then he can finally be named. So they named the boy Pryderi, the one who was worried for, the one who was longed for. And then he has his own set of stories. So what I did in this school was I told this portion and I gave them one task. Go to your art supplies, bring them out and draw me the monster. The monster's not described in this tale. Heroes, typically in mythology, are not described in great detail. And that's used by modern authors as well. Harry Potter's got a scar, he's got glasses, but he's a little bit of an every boy character. You can imbue yourself onto that character. This is true of Odysseus, this is true of Heracles, this is true of a great number of heroes. They're not described in painstaking detail, but the monsters, the antagonists are, because you want to see them, you want to recognize what great evil is. Whereas you then can become a hero, so you can add yourself in. This monster, this antagonist isn't described. So all the kids go at it, and some of them it's an arm with wings and two eyes. Some of it is a werewolf. Some of it is a tentacle monster with one clawed arm. Loads of different things, you know. And there's one little girl at the end of the day at the school gates. She came up to me before her parents picked her up. And she said, "Why isn't the monster described?" And I said, "I don't know. Could be lots of reasons. It's probably because there was once a description. By the time it was written down in the 12th, 13th century, the description of the monster is gone, and the monk who wrote it down had no idea, so he left it out. That's probably the reason, but it might not be. There might be other reasons. Why do you think?" This is a 7-year-old girl said it's much scarier that way. And I said, yeah.
Wow. That's the Alfred Hitchcock method, right? You don't show the violence actually happening. You just sort of suggest it and let the audience fill in the blanks. And this is, again, there's just huge overlap here with the hypnosis practice that in a moment, I will be telling a story of the great Milton Erickson, who I don't know if I should say famously, because I don't know how famous the story is, but he was able to achieve helping a cancer patient achieve basically full remission of pain, not the cancer itself, but the pain that he was going through merely by telling a story. And I'll set that up in a bit, but you'll see throughout that tale, the way he tells the story, he doesn't describe the monster, so to speak. He doesn't describe the patient in detail becoming better and better. He leaves this ambiguity loop, and that allows the person in the patient chair, or in your case, the audience's chair, to just fill in the blanks with whatever their imagination is connecting to. And that is the moment of power, because now I am the one telling the story in some way. My mind is doing half of the work of creating the monster, of creating the hero. I hadn't noticed that about the Harry Potter stories, because I read all those books, years ago. But you're right. That is it's a hypnotic practice. It's an author practice. Scott Adams talked about the same thing, because he was a hypnotist, but also you might say a storyteller, in the fact that he wrote these little 3-panel stories every week called Dilbert. And he says explicitly, I never gave Dilbert a last name. I never tell you what company he works at. I never tell you what city he's in, because then it becomes too identifiable, and somebody else will say, I don't identify with this anymore. And as long as he was just General Dilbert guy in some office somewhere, anybody could identify with Harry Potter, or with, as you say, the open loop of the monster and who is the hero and so on. That's fascinating stuff. And great that the 7-year-old picked up on. It's just more scary that way.
A 7-year-old that I doubt very much had ever watched Psycho comes to that conclusion. Blew my mind. She was a smart girl. She was a bright girl. Her work was really good, but that's a real insight.
That's huge. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder what she's doing today. Very interesting. I was going to mention, not to go too far afield, but you also, if I recall right from previous times we've talked, you had a career also as a stand-up comic, right?
Very, very briefly at the very beginning, from the age of about 14 until my inglorious retirement at 18. I was, though, but I was paid to do it, so I was a professional comic. I then later, of course, I became a sitcom actor, lead in a sitcom here in the UK, and did some writing as well, comedy writing. When I say I retired at 18, I stopped pursuing it as a sole goal. I would do it in my spare time on request, usually because somebody didn't turn up, and they said you could do it. So I went on, and I'd do a 20, I'd do an hour sometimes, and it got to the point where I was so sick of my own thoughts that I would ad lib and mess around with the audience. There was one night where I'm not going to run through my material, and I don't particularly want to do audience work. So I decided on the cab over to the place that I was performing that I would go up and do a character, and it was 20 seconds before I went on that I decided. And I did this whole spiel about, I'm sorry, I haven't done stand-up in a really long time, and I kept holding my head like that. And I was like, but I've had a really tough time the last few years. Big from the audience. And I said, no, this is serious. And I kept chiding them. I kept saying, no, shut up. Saying, just stop. I've got to get this out. I came off my motorcycle. I had a traumatic brain injury. No, and I'm like, stop, please. This is really distracting me. And then there was silence. And I said, but I'm being brave, and this is my first time on stage, smattering of claps. And I was like, and I just need to get out. I need to do some jokes, but I'm scared they're not going to come out right. So will you be kind with me in the audience? Yeah. And what I did was just old-fashioned jokes. But the punchline and the feed line were the wrong ones. And I was testing to see how long it took the audience to get that it was a bit. So I was just going like, why did the chicken cross the road? Come on, you meant to say something. And they were like, why? And I was like, Psh. Silence. What? And I was like, what do you call a fish with no eyes? Which is the last punchline.
Right.
And I was like, those aren't pillows.
Oh, no.
So when it started to get laughter, because they were like, all right, he's messing around and stuff like that, I would make up feed lines and punchlines on the spot, which sounded like they were real. So I was like, a Mexican, a rabbi, and a horse tamer walk into a bar. I don't know. I want to get off this airplane. And this was so absurd that it was the biggest wall of laughter just the whole time, because they were like, we have no idea what's going on. This guy may actually have a traumatic brain injury, in which case we should probably call someone, but it doesn't matter. And it was just my way of getting through those 20 minutes.
Devious. That's so, you got a bit of the social arsonist in you, I think. Just burn it all down.
Yeah.
Which I approve. I approve entirely. So that's interesting to go from, I mean, you could say comedy is kind of a form of storytelling anyway, but to go into actual storytelling. And I believe you've said in the past on some of your X spaces that you do these stories that you are writing some of your own stories.
Yes, at the end of this year, in fact, I will be a published author. I have a book coming out, and later on my social media, if you guys follow me, I'll reveal more of the details, because I'm in the proofreading stage and things now, so I don't want to jinx it. That's what I don't want to do. But yes, there will be a book of folk tales from my area that's going to be published, but that's more collecting. I do also engage in creative writing. I work with a lot of authors, groups of authors and things, and bring storytelling to them. But in doing so, I also have to engage in creative writing. I've been a script writer and a staff writer as well, so it's been familiar. I've written ever since I was little, poetry as well, mainly in my native tongue in Welsh. But it's when it comes to the creative writing process versus storytelling, you're dealing with the fixed versus the creative. It's very difficult to say that storytelling is a creative medium. I mean, it is, but you're starting from a place of reverence for something that already is. So you've got to be extremely careful, and it's one has to have quite a firm code of ethics in approaching the stories, because they already exist, they're already circulating. You can't take too much license. You can't change the meaning of the tale in order to suit some kind of a political narrative, or it ceases to be art and it becomes propaganda. And I'm not a propagandist, so the tale is the tale. But there are so many versions, and there is license and play in the joins. Whereas when you're engaged in creative writing, it's creative. the beautiful thing, though, is I can draw on the tales that I already know as inspiration. And so I still enjoy writing stories, and there has been occasion once or twice where, as part of very specific projects, that I've been afforded the ability to engage in the art form of storytelling, but with something I've created myself. And
right. And that, I think that was more the heart of the question is,
yeah,
not necessarily strictly literally writing down, because you said you got a book coming out, but when you go up on stage and perform, I assume that some of those are your own tales that you've created.
if it depends on the engagement, it depends on the evening. The majority of my performances, I don't know until I'm on stage the tales I'm going to tell. I am moved by the environment and the audience, and it's drawn out of me. But there are occasions where I'm on a specific project. I've just finished one called Ceri, where it was about the constellations and telling stories about the stars. I'm not going to engage in that project and go, here's a story about a bridge and there's not a star in it. It'll just be like, well, that's not the project. So I do have to curate a little bit and work on a project-specific basis. And there are occasions, and there's a show that I have in development right now, which are entirely stories that I have composed, but they're all influenced by the Welsh bardic tradition in trying to extract narrative from those often very enigmatic and very narrative light pieces. But I've been working on about a span of about 1,000 years, between maybe a little bit more than that, 1,500 years, from roughly the year 500 up until 1500, drawing from those works and then writing pieces inspired by them. And I've got about 15 of those tales, so about 10 hours worth of material, so I could do 3 or 4 shows, and it's been a real labor of love, that has. I can't wait to get that out there.
You said a very important thing a few minutes ago as you were describing wanting to be faithful to the material and not wanting to add this or take away that to make a political point, because at that point it becomes propaganda. And I know you and I have bantered back and forth at spaces about this very topic, that this is sort of what's missing right now in the politics in the US especially. And there's this sort of, Hollywood hasn't done anything good in 10 years. Look at the movies we used to get in the 90s versus what we see today. And it's all just so heavy-handed, preachy propaganda. And it's all from a particular political viewpoint. But we've also said, the conservative efforts to counteract that and bring their own material is typically equally heavy-handed and propagandistic, and you're like, no, this just reeks. I mean, everything reeks of politics at this point. But my goodness, the tradition of communicating morality, philosophy, higher values, through the story medium has been thousands of years, right? We go back to something as simple as Aesop's fables. And these are all morality tales, but they're all told in a way that are, again, folks, I tell you, it's hypnotic, because we're taking you to a different place in your imagination, in the subconscious, and those funny little morality pieces, ethics, the politics, everything just sort of gets snuck in a subconscious way, because all you care about is the talking fox, that can't reach the grapes or whatever. And the rest is sort of residue. That's what makes it so powerful. And I think if maybe we're better off at the moment that there seems to be a stalemate between the two political sides, and neither one of them seems to be able to tell a story at this point, because God help us if they figure it out. We'll never be able to withstand, the stream of propaganda. I didn't really set you up for a question on that one. I was just sort of opining.
No, it's fine.
There.
There's the tales are already there. If you are more of a conservative mindset, then the American canon, so to speak, of the tall tales, the unbelievably rich tradition of urban legends, which America is the motherlode of urban legends. And you're talking about morality tales. These are not just latter-day morality tales, almost all of them. There are subgenres and subcategorizations of urban legends, of course, which come from very different places. But for the most part, the babysitter and the man downstairs, or the hook, or people can lick too. These are morality tales. It's, hey kids, maybe think about not going up to make out point together. You're 15. That's what those stories are. Because there might be a serial killer. That's what the story is. But it's kids, don't do that. Whereas, when you think about Aesop's fables, it's doing the exact same thing. But the beautiful thing about the urban legends is that it is a living tradition. Most of the oral tradition as we have has been set in place by literature. It has been written, and so we have a definitive version. Whereas with urban legends, that's still doing what tales do and have always done, which is going from ear to mouth and mouth to ear. And that's why they're also called, according to Jan Harold Brunvand, which is maybe America's greatest folklorist, who's got the most exhaustive chronicling of urban legends. Incredible academic. I don't think he coined the term. However, he often uses friend of a friend stories to describe them, because that's what they are. There's always a sense of this actually happened, which is what makes it an urban legend as opposed to a folk tale. And when you consider what those things are and the underpinning of culture that gives you, it's not telling you how to live, it's making suggestions as to what not to do. That's what's missing with political narratives. Political narratives now are telling you what to do, not giving you a suggestion what not to do.
Right. And I'm translating this all through the filter of hypnosis and the practice and so on. And it is sort of the equivalent of the new hypnotist who has only learned from the textbooks and has a template for, this person wants to quit smoking. So, okay, I have my checklist of the 5 things you're supposed to do and say, but that's coming at it from the conscious mind level. And the hypnosis thing does not work if you're not engaging the subconscious by way of imagination, by way of emotion. And so if you're coming at it from a storytelling standpoint and you're too politically heavy-handed and telling people what to do, what to think, you're just you're attacking the castle right at the front gate where all the guards are. And that's a very common metaphor for the mind, that the conscious mind has a set of guards at the gate that nope, you can't come in here, that thought can't get in. You have to sneak around the back gate with emotion, with imagery, with exercising the world of make-believe, or it doesn't work. You know what they're doing, you know what they're saying.
Yeah. The relationship between the bards and the cyfarwyddiaid, which is the plural of what I am, cyfarwydd, it's interesting. The bards were always tasked to sing the canon. So they would take the tales, they would take the culture, they would take the philosophy, the laws, the history, and the stories, and filter that through awen, which is bardic inspiration, which is that funhouse mirror of art and verse and rhyme back into the world. So when you read ancient Welsh poetry, bardic creations, you get a sense of the stories without hearing them. They're alluded to, and of course the listeners in the tavern or the court or wherever they're listening to would know the tales as the reference points. So what you're getting are cultural references to build upon the beauty of the verse. Sometimes the bardic creations, of course, were a chronicle of things that happened in song, but they will often make allusions to scripture, but also allusions to the canon. They had to go to the cyfarwydd in order to hear these tales. So the basis, even of artistic creation, are the stories themselves. They aren't artistic in nature, they are foundational. It is culture itself, are the stories. The only thing that precedes storytelling as an art form, the only thing that's pre-linguistic, is pictorial art. And when you look at cave paintings, they are stories. There's the movement of the hunt. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's not a self-portrait. It's not a landscape, it's a story in pictorial form.
A great point. There were no on the cave walls. There were no selfies. I don't think.
Yep.
Usually moving things. So I had asked you before we set up this interview if you would be so kind as to bring a tale and tell the audience a tale. And I would like to close on that. So I will do my bit with the Milton Erickson story because I've always wanted you to hear this and give your thoughts, on sort of like, oh, that makes sense because of this and that and the other thing. So if you don't mind, I'll share that part first, and then we can talk a little bit, and then you can end us with one of your tales.
I'd love to.
So the story, or sorry, you're going to say something?
No, I'm just settling in to enjoy.
Good, good. The story, and this comes from a very academic and boring book that only academics like me would find interesting, called Patterns of the Hypnotic Techniques of Milton Erickson by Bandler and Grinder. But this is a great story. The setup is that the patient, it says, who will be called Joe for convenience, he was a florist. Ever since he was a boy, he had saved his pennies and bought flowers to sell. And then when he was old enough and saved enough money, he had built or purchased rather a parcel of land to grow more flowers. And then he made more money and bought more land and grew more flowers, and eventually became one of the leading florists in the city. Unfortunately, later in life, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had to have something removed from the side of his face, and he was given the diagnosis that he had a month left to live. And so obviously you have the distress, of the diagnosis, but in addition to that, the story is that he was in so much pain, extreme, severe pain, that was untouchable. They were giving him morphine, they were giving him Demerol. Nothing was touching the pain, such that he was no longer sleeping properly. He was no longer eating properly. Even drinking water was something he was not doing that much of. With all of those things missing, all those necessary things for the human experience, he was wasting away and very much looking like he would no longer be around within that month time frame that was forecasted for him. Now, it doesn't say exactly how this came about, because Milton Erickson at this time was one of the rare people in psychiatry and psychology who was willing to use hypnosis as part of the clinical practice. This is at a time when hypnosis was sort of considered junk science. And it says that one of Joe's relatives reached out to Milton Erickson and asked if he could use hypnosis on Joe for pain relief. And so it was agreed that he would come to the hospital and visit with Joe. But we have this wonderful sort of, the caveat is that they informed Milton Erickson before he was even introduced to Joe that Joe disliked even the mention of the word hypnosis. One of Joe's children was in psychiatry and did not believe that hypnosis was a real thing. So Joe, too, had no desire to interact with anything touching the realm of hypnosis. So you can imagine the difficulty here in that Milton Erickson has to come as a hypnotist and use hypnosis to try to achieve a pain relief for a pain that is so extreme that even the best of the medicines won't touch it. Oh, and by the way, you're not allowed to actually practice hypnosis. You're not allowed to do the usual, you're getting sleepy, take a deep breath, relax, I'm going to put you into a trance. None of that. Can't be done, or you'll get kicked out. So he arrives, it says, let me just skip ahead a little bit here. Oh yeah, that's the other fun little caveat in this, that Joe at that point had had a tracheotomy and no longer had use of his voice. So there goes the opportunity for sort of collaborative storytelling. This is going to be an entirely one-way process that is surreptitious hypnosis. And so here's how this goes. They finally sat down. Erickson asked for the family to be let out of the room. It's just Joe and Milton sitting there. And so I'm going to read several passages from what is captured of the transcript. so you can get an idea of the flavor of how Milton Erickson would tell a story, and just dropping in so many little subconscious references using that hypnotic ambiguity to let Joe insert himself into the story in these different ways. Joe, I would like to talk to you. I know you are a florist, that you grow flowers, and I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin, and I liked growing flowers. I still do. So I'd like to have you take a seat in that easy chair as I talk to you. I'm going to say a lot of things to you, but it won't be about flowers because you know more than I do about flowers. That isn't what you want. And now as I talk, and I can do so comfortably, I wish that you will listen to me comfortably as I talk about a tomato plant. That is an odd thing to talk about. It makes one curious. Why talk about a tomato plant? One puts a tomato seed in the ground. One can feel hope that it will grow into a tomato plant that will bring satisfaction by the fruit it has. The seed soaks up water, not very much difficulty in doing that because of the rains that bring peace and comfort and the joy of growing to flowers and tomatoes. That little seed, Joe, slowly swells, sends out a little rootlet with cilia on it. Now, you may not know what cilia are, but cilia are things that work to help the tomato seed grow, to push up above the ground as a sprouting plant. And you can listen to me, Joe, so I will keep on talking, and you can keep on listening, just wondering what you can really learn. And here is your pencil and your pad. But speaking of the tomato plant, it grows so slowly. You cannot see it grow. You cannot hear it grow, but grow it does. The first little leaf-like things on the stalk, the fine little hairs on the stem, those hairs are on the leaves too, like the cilia on the roots. They must make the tomato plant feel very good, very comfortable. If you think of a plant as feeling, and then you can't see it growing, you can't feel it growing, but another leaf appears on that little tomato stalk, and then another. Maybe, and this is talking like a child, maybe the tomato plant does feel comfortable and peaceful as it grows. Each day it grows and grows and grows. It's so comfortable, Joe, to watch a plant grow and not see its growth and not feel, but just know that all is getting better for that little tomato plant that is adding yet another leaf and still another and a branch, and it is growing comfortably in all directions. Now, at this point in the story, it said that because the family had been taken out of the room, but they were observing, it says that Joe's wife came tiptoeing into the room carrying a sheet of paper on which was written the question, "When are you going to start the hypnosis?" The author failed to cooperate with her by looking at the paper, and it was necessary for her to then thrust the sheet of paper in front of Milton Erickson, and therefore in front of Joe. Erickson continuing his description of the tomato plant uninterruptedly, and Joe's wife, as she looked at Joe, saw that he was not seeing her, did not know she was there, and that he was already deeply in a trance state. And so just a little bit more of the sort of the script that he goes through here. I like this part where he gets into now making the suggestions about, I think, eating and drinking. So he goes on, and soon the tomato plant will have a bud form somewhere on one branch or another, but it makes no difference because all the branches, the whole tomato plant, will soon have those nice little buds. I wonder if the tomato plant can, Joe, really feel a kind of comfort. You know, Joe, a plant is a wonderful thing, and it is so nice, so pleasing, just to be able to think about a plant as if it were a man. Would such a plant have nice feelings, a sense of comfort as the tiny little tomatoes begin to form, so tiny, yet so full of promise to give you the desire to eat a luscious tomato, sun-ripened? It's so nice to have food in one's stomach, that wonderful feeling a thirsty child has and can want a drink, Joe. Is that the way the tomato plant feels when the rain falls and washes everything so that all feels well? You know, Joe, a tomato plant just flourishes each day, just a day at a time. I like to think the tomato plant can know the fullness of comfort each day. You know, Joe, just one day at a time for the tomato plant. That's the way for all tomato plants. And so the story goes on that he went on this way for actually a couple of hours, and they took a break for lunch. And then he came back and continued in that vein for another couple of hours. You talk about somebody that can just tell a story and keep going and keep going.
Mm.
And the end of the story is remember that Joe had a terminal diagnosis of 1 month left to live. He's in pain. He can't sleep. He can't eat, can't drink. After this point, after that day of intervention, he regained his appetite and began to drink and began to sleep and had very, not a complete erasure of the pain, but they said so many pain-free days that on the occasion when it might flare up a little bit, it was easily treated with some over-the-counter aspirin or whatever. And as he gets back to resting again and eating again and drinking again and not dealing with the pain, he lived another 4 months. He did not die within that month's time frame. And if you noted, I remember I mentioned the month, it was October when he was diagnosed. And that means that he was able to have one more Thanksgiving and one more Christmas with his family and one more New Year's with his family in a much healthier state. And so I don't know what you think about that, but I find it fascinating that without any sort of formal hypnotic tricks or techniques or whatever, just the telling of a story. And obviously there's a lot of crisscross of, is it the plant or is it Joe? Who's feeling comfortable? Who's resting there? I'll leave it at that.
That's amazing. I'm reminded of an anecdote that's told about New Orleans, about the 1930s, where there was the one doctor on the ward that wasn't from the north, a transplant from the north down south, all Harvard educated, all, glittering doctors from the far more developed places of the States. There was the one local guy, and there was a patient that came in, and he was presenting with untreatable symptoms. He was wasting away. He was dying. He was not able to keep down food. He was running a high fever. He was in a manic state. And diagnosis was, whatever's wrong with this guy, he's going to die. And they were asking him what's up, and they were doing tests on him. It turned out that he said a witch, a voodoo witch has cursed me. She was out on the bayou, I was out on the bayou, we crossed paths, and she put a spell on me where there's a lizard inside me eating me alive and eating my life force, and I'm going to die. And so the one doctor on the ward who was from the area, who knew that this guy is going to die, went out to a pet store, purchased an iguana. He came back in a robe, painted his face, and created a potion, which was just some kind of soft drink, but with an emetic inside it. And he went to the patient and said, I confronted her and I killed her. And now the spell must be lifted from you. You must drink this, which is a potion I've made from her blood. And once you do that, you will be released. And they were dancing and doing some kind of a voodoo chant. And he gave the patient the potion, which was obviously going to induce vomiting. And as he was sick on the floor, the doctor allowed for the iguana to come out of his sleeve, fall into the floor, and he cut off its head. And the patient left that day.
Oh my gosh. It is incredible. That's phenomenal. It's
in
the
the book,
same thing, right? We're talking about the exact same thing, right? The interaction with the person's subconscious. In this case, the doctor quite literally entering into this person's story that they've told themselves, and saying, "I'll work with your material. That's fine." This is why template hypnosis doesn't really work. You have to get into the subject's mind and story and say, "I'll come in there with you." And then help you kind of recraft the tale a little bit, whether it's a tomato plant or, a grandfather's barn that you've seen or something. But
Yeah.
I love that.
I think that they do call, because it's an example of the nocebo effect, of course, of an
Mhm.
imagined pain, of a self-generated pain, and that can be fatal. Um, I think it's colloquially also called voodoo death syndrome. So I mean, it's the tale itself informs, the nomenclature, which I think is fabulous. It was in a book I read that was released. It was like a compilation book from the New Scientist, some science magazine called Nothing. It was a series of essays on nothing. So in this case, there's nothing wrong
Right?
in a real sense. And there was articles about rather nerdy articles about paint drying and grass growing, where they'd actually measured things for boringness, and there was the usual stuff about black holes and the number zero and things like that. But that's the one that stuck with me, is the nocebo and placebo effect. And the example of the nocebo effect, I think, is the most effective, because it's
Hmm.
like, well, you saved the guy's life.
Well, I mean, even in the placebo effect, all of the literature and study that, I've come across recently that suggests that, yeah, we have a standardized number that's like, I think, 30%. Placebos work 30% of the time, but it turns out that that is an old tale of its own. It has existed for decades, and that actually, when you get into the details of setting the mental expectation for the patient, so things like what you just described, the patient has this story about a witch, and if we can get into that story, the placebo or nocebo works much, much better. Turns out it's true of actual placebos too.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, acupuncture based placebos tend to work better the closer you get to China because it's already supported in the culture. And I was reminded, yeah, I've been reading through a book on the history of hypnosis, of just there was a doctor in the 1800s who was from England and learned to use hypnosis as an anesthesia for his surgery patients, but he was practicing in Calcutta. So he was in
Mm-hmm.
India and had great success, just phenomenal success, and really expected that when he got back home to England, this would be a continued success, but it wasn't. In fact, he was stripped and mocked and, died in humiliation. And it's all
Mm-hmm.
because if you think of the culture, India is already kind of on that, the sort of mystic, altered states of consciousness, meditation. They were much more open to the hypnotic experience. And when he got back to England, this is the 1800s, the story says that the Church of England in particular had already developed a theology of pain, that it was necessary to purge the soul. And so they wanted nothing to do with his, anesthesia by hypnosis until a couple of decades later when finally things like chloroform came along, so
Yeah.
chemical anesthesia. And suddenly it's open season. Oh, yeah, suddenly God doesn't care about the pain anymore, but you're fine. Have the chloroform. And it turns out that like the use of the chemical anesthesias like chloroform, because it wasn't well known, like the dosages that should be used, they were killing patients through overdosing on the chemical versions. While the whole time this man is sitting here with all this experience of the hypnosis impact, but no, we can't do that. So culture, expectation, it's all part of it. Carrie, I would love to hear what tale you have prepared for us. And I am just going to lean back in my chair and let myself go into a happy little trance while you do this.
Very well. As I said near the beginning of this podcast, it is very rare that I come prepared with a tale. I will let the conversation or the environment or the audience themselves dictate as to which tale I'm going to tell. And this is no different. This circumstance is and has driven me to tell you this particular tale. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, there was a farmer. His name was Tun. His mother and his father, they owned the farm, and it was a prosperous farm. Not the richest farm you've ever seen, but it did quite well. It was right next to a lake called Llyn y Fan Fach, up in the Brecon Beacon Mountains. Beautiful, glistening lake. It would shine black very often at night. It looked like a dark eye. It would stare up at the moon. The only colour that you could see on the lake was the path that the moon would create on its surface. It led straight to the farm that Tom worked on. That farm, it gave you a decent crop of vegetables. They made hay, of course, and then there were the animals, which flourished. Even though it was up in the mountains, the land was fertile enough. And then one day his parents died, rather unexpectedly. Tom was left, as an only son, with a farm, an inheritance. He was still a very young man. So he went to it to work as diligently as he could. And he kept the place going. In fact, he expanded a little bit. And the only thing that was missing was a farmer's wife for Tom. Now, he'd relied on the fact that every Sunday he would go down to church, and he thought, just as many of his friends were starting to do, he would meet a girl, one of the many girls from the many villages that would go to this church, would pair up and be married. As the years passed, one by one, every boy paired up with a girl and got married, until there were none left. So Tom, being now a very successful farmer and a drover to boot, would drive his animals up to London and Hereford and Bristol to sell. He thought, well, I'm on the road quite a lot, so as I stop in one of these prosperous towns, I will meet an eligible young lady and marry her and bring her home. Many years and many journeys went by, and still there was no wife for him. So he resigned himself to the life of a bachelor, kept working on the farm which had been in his family for generations, and resolved that on his death he would likely leave the farm to the church. Every night before bed, Tom would kneel before his window looking out, especially when the moon was full, creating that silvery path, and he would pray. He would pray to God a silent, desperate prayer to deliver him a wife. Before getting up, calling himself a fool, and then, eventually, after many years, an old fool, and going to bed. One night, in the midst of a storm, he prayed that silent prayer, and as he got up, the clouds parted, and the moonlight shone that path, and on the very shore of the lake he saw a woman standing in the maelstrom. So he rushed out. She was clearly lost, and in a very dangerous place up in the mountains. He went out with his lamp and his stick, and he called out over the wind to her, "Wy ti ar goll? Are you lost?" She turned to look at him. It's the most beautiful woman the man had ever seen. Tom approached her, put a shawl around her, brought her into the house. He asked her to stay, and she said yes. "What were you looking for?" he asked. She said, "Why, a husband." They were married, Tom and this mysterious woman. And she became the consummate farmer's wife. She wasn't only beautiful, she was bright, she was inquisitive, she was a hard worker, harder than any labourer Tom had ever had on the farm. She worked. Now, he'd become a recluse over the years. Of course, he was a gentleman farmer up on his own on the side of that hill. Now, he showed off his wife to all of his neighbours, went to church again, and in the village, they became the talk. Years went by and they were happy. Tom started thinking about children with his wife, but before he could have that conversation, rather abruptly, in front of the fire one evening, before they were to retire to bed, the lady said, "I'm homesick. Will you come visit where I am from?" And Tom said, "Yes, I'll come visit. How long are we talking? Are we talking a week? Because I can get a couple of boys from the village to tend to the farm, to go to, Oh, you never told me where you're from. Well, at least I can meet your parents and your siblings. I don't know, do you have brothers or sisters? In fact, are your parents still alive?" And she said, "No, I'd like to go for a good deal longer than that." And he said, "Well, maybe if I really pay a couple of those boys to do some droving for me, I could see to it that we were gone for a month. I really am curious as to where you're from. And this is when she said it. No, I would like to return home. I would like you to come with me. You'll love it there. You will be so happy with me there. And we would not return. Tom said, fine, we'll go for a whole season. I will shell out a lot of money, and I will have them look after my farm, and woe betide them if they put one finger wrong in our absence for that whole season. She said, I am going to leave. You are free to come with me, or you will remain. So Tom called his wife's bluff. He went to bed alone. In the morning she was gone. He laughed. He hadn't made his own breakfast since she'd come into his life, but he tried, and he ate something and went out and worked, and a day went by, and then a week, and then a month. Then after 5 years, Tom started praying at that window again. Every night until his last, he prayed, not for a new wife to be sent, but for her to show him the way, to find her. On his deathbed, Tom couldn't muster the strength to go to the window to pray, so he did from his bed, and he heard her voice, saying, Fy nghariad, my love, I came to you every night and showed you the way. The moon's silvery path across the lake, that is where I am. With strength that no dying man should have, Tom lifted himself out of the bed, walked from the farmhouse, along the silvery path of the lake, to his wife, never to be seen again. The end.
That is phenomenal. Wow. I don't know, it's your technique. It's the rhythm, it's the descriptives. It's so, oh, we had a word for it earlier and I've already forgotten what it was. Say
Sexy.
it. I was going to say absorbing, but yes, sexy is exactly the word that I was thinking of. Wow, that is fun. And you say
Before
you have,
we wrap, that
yeah, yeah,
story you
yeah.
won't find in any chronicle. It is a variation of a story called The Lady of the Lake. Not the Arthurian Lady of the Lake, is an
Mm.
actual folk tale, which is very similar, but she comes from the lake as opposed to who knows in this tale. And there's a lot of differences. It's a famous folk tale in my neck of the woods, about the same lake. But that version, my nan told me, my mother's mother, told me when I was 8. And it's one of the only stories she told that I was convinced she didn't make up, because why would she tell that to an 8-year-old boy?
Oh, wow. Great.
Uh,
You were saying you have how many hundreds of these memorized? Is
about
that,
370 at last count.
oh my goodness. Wow. This has just been a fun experience. It's again, it's the US. I don't really know. I've never met a storyteller that does it for, a profession. So this is already kind of a unique little treat. Maybe next time we'll lean more into the comedy side of things as we are known to do. And I was kind of laughing to myself earlier when you were talking about the rich American folklore and just how many stories you and I have completely butchered together on X Spaces with Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed, just ruining the tales. So we'll have to do a variation on that next time we talk.
Certainly, certainly. It's been a
Thank you so
delight.
much, Gary. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you soon.